Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, we talk about Richard Rorty and his essay Postmodernist, bourgeois liberalism, which was published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1983. I had not read anything about Richard Rorty before. I didn't know who this person was, his political ideas, his kind of philosophy. But because in this kind of 10 weeks of online lesson that I am having with my friends from the philosophy and the politics department, somebody suggests us to study this essay, and I found it fascinating, very interesting, because overall Richard Rorty has this idea that all the perceptions that we have in our surroundings are communicated through language, and henceforth it is the language that form our perceptions of reality. Like in the different times of history, you have a kind of different ideas because your environment conditions yourself. Also, the way that you speak, it is not the same if you are being born, let's say, in France than in Colombia. Not just for this social economic condition, the geographical distribution of the country, the landscape, the weather, and so on, but also the language that you speak. It conforms the reality as it is. And I really like this because it kind of aligns with the idea of Jacques Derrida when he says that there is nothing outside the text. So the French philosopher referred to that everything that is out of language, it does not make sense. So everything that we are communicating is how we shape reality. And this is fundamental in order to understand the postmodern current, which groups like this kind of French philosopher like Derrida, Michel Foucault, also Richard Rorty, and many others. This idea that there is not absolute truth, this distrust in meta-narratives, as Jean-François Lyotard, one of the kind of proponents of postmodernism, mentioned, meta-narrative as this kind of determinate study of history in which you can extrapolate one idea and create a general rule about that. So these meta-narratives do not exist anymore according to this postmodern, and therefore everything can be attainable to debate. But it does not mean that discussing it is not important because you cannot achieve the absolute truth with capital T. On the contrary, Rorty mentioned that it's fundamental that we keep engaging in the society in order to change the aspects that are completely unfair in order to provide well-being for the most majority of the people. So Rorty divides the kind of political theories, philosophers, in two groups. On the one hand, you have the Kantians, followers of Immanuel Kant, and on the other, the Hegelians, from the German philosopher Hegel. For him, the Kantians are, quote, the people who think there are such things as intrinsic human dignity and intrinsic human rights, end quote. In other words, the Kantians, according to Rorty, are those people who do not believe that historical materialism has conditioned their life. For example, the perfect example of this is the idea of the human rights. We believe on human rights, or some people do, as myself, but human rights is something that was created in 1948 after the Second World War. It was kind of legislation in order to create a state of peace in Europe and in the whole world. It was this idea that all humans have right to live, to dignity, to equality, and so on. But this was through a kind of historical process. However, the Kantians will say that no, but this is the way that society must be portrayed because it's the most egalitarian kind of idea. The problem is that many things, apart from a historical kind of development that the Kantians ignore, is the fact that in the name of human rights, there have been many atrocities committed. And this is one of my main concerns about the Kantian idea, which I support the Kantian idea of human rights, but I don't like the fact that this idea has been implemented by the Western countries to invade regions like Afghanistan, Iraq, with the idea to bring democracy to those people. This is always an euphemism used in order to exploit those countries, take the resources, and enrich themselves. United States is the most anti-Kantian country following Kantian ideas. What I mean is that they try to fulfill the ideas of the alignment of equality, freedom, and so on, but they are doing in order to just enrich themselves and exploit other countries, which this is far away from the idea that Kant established in the essay of 1794 on perpetual peace, in which he advocated for a global system based on the relations between nations, based on common solidarity. And in fact, Kant mentioned how it would be much better to reduce the expenditure in military and use these resources to create schools, hospitals, and kind of institution that will certainly increase the well-being of the people. And if we think what is happening now, in which US is pushing Europe to spend more GDP resources on armament in order to enrich themselves, enrich the United States, and create a kind of warlike area in Europe, this is obviously all against Kantian. On the other hand, the Hegelians, for Richard Rorty, are those people who believe, quote, humanity is a biological rather than a moral notion, end quote. So nothing to be responsible to except person and actual or possible historical communities. Then the idea of the social responsibility is misleading and does not exist. This, I think, it was quietly rationalized by Stalin when he said that left and right does not matter. Here, the important thing is the spheres of influence. When you conquer a country, you kind of have the power of that country. That is the only thing. And I think the Hegelian idea is this kind of historical development in which, let's say, if the revolution happened in France in 1799, before other countries in Europe, it was for different socioeconomic historical reasons. First of all, because the French state was in bankruptcy after helping the United States to get their independence from United Kingdom. They were providing them with resources, with funds, economic means, and so on. This left the French state without any kind of money to spend, so they had to raise the taxes among the population, which they have been exploited for many centuries, and this was the spark that ignited the revolution. Obviously, the kind of alignment ideals was important, but at that time, the majority of the people who uprised against the ancient regime in France did not know how to read or write, and henceforth it was the material conditions that made that country, made Paris become the hub of the revolutionary ideas. And why in the next centuries have happened revolutions in Paris, like in 1830, 1832, 1848, 1871 with the Paris Commune, or the French May in 1968? Well, it is important because those had their story of the city, and the legacy of Paris, according to their ideas, was to follow the example of the revolution. In that sense, because Paris had become the kind of modern city after the French Revolution and later after the Restoration and so on, those ideas had permeated among society, and the importance of the revolution in their history was something that, since they were kids, was in their upbringing in the schools. It was taught the idea of the revolution, and this created a society in which those people could follow those historical process that was inherent not to their kind of blood or the genetic, but to the idea in which that society was built on. In other words, you cannot export a revolution in other countries, as was the idea of Che Guevara, of other kind of Marxist intellectuals, but each country must have their own kind of development according to the Hegelians. Aside from that distinction, Richard Rorty analyzed how the Hegelians believe that the idea of the moral self is a network of belief, desires, and emotion, a network that is constantly renewing itself, not to reference to moral principles, but to the environment that is surrounding. This is very important because when you have developed a thought in your life, being for the influence of your school, your family, your friends, the books that you have read at the library, this does not mean that you can reach a point end, but rather there is always a path to walk by, because the kind of ideas that can save yourself and the experience that you can live through are so constant that it can make you change your initial ideas. Michael Sandel is one of the figures that Rorty cites, and his statement, I think, is paradigmatic about this situation. He points, quote, "We cannot regard ourselves as Kantian subjects capable of constituting meaning on our own, without great cost to those loyalties and convictions whose moral force consists partly in the fact that living by them is inseparable from understanding ourselves as the particular people we are," end quote. In other words, if I have a concrete belief, it is because the way that I have been raised has made me to have this belief. Then if I have a discussion with a person that has lived in another area, even in the same area where I live, the kind of economic, political, cultural, social influence that we have had since we were kids had a great influence in our upbringing and the way that we see the world. So we need to be aware of that when we engage in debates with other people. It is important to remember that our truth, the thing that we think is right, it is so because we have been raised in that way, or we have been reading different kind of texts and so on. But Richard Rorty rejects the idea that there is an absolute truth that can hold all the discussions. In other words, the idea of debating will never end. What else Richard Rorty say here? This is very interesting because he points how the political discourse of the democracies at its best it's the exchange of what Wittgenstein called reminders for a particular purpose. And in that sense, he explains that in the US, it was a common consensus among the intellectuals in which the American system was well versed to bring progress, and this was broke according to him during the Vietnam War, which produced a losing of identity in the American population. Noam Chomsky, the anarchist philosopher, political theorist, and linguistics, say that the war was immoral, one which they had no right to engage in the first place. And this, for Rorty, epitomized the loss of American appeal for their own country. I am not so sure about that because I've been reading John Dewey, which he mentions in his test, Walter Lippmann and Noam Chomsky, and I feel there are some changes between those. John Dewey was writing in the second half of the 19th century. I think the book Democracy and Education was published in the 1880s, and he is true that believes that the American way was perfect to ensure progress, and it was important to kind of create an homogeneous school in order to group all the pluralistic society to follow just one idea. But Walter Lippmann, 40 years later, mentioned in the On Public Opinion and the Preface to Politics how the different ideas implemented in societies were being followed through this pseudo environment that we create in order to understand better the reality. I analyze what is the pseudo environment in another episode, but it's the idea that because the world is so complex, we tend to try to know itself, reading some newspapers, speaking with different people, but this kind of perception of the world can never be perfect because the world is so difficult to understand, and we will believe that this pseudo environment will help us to comprehend the world. But Lippmann warned us that this pseudo environment is full of different economic interests. Like when you read a newspaper, you need to be aware that for this newspaper to be sustained itself, it needs the economic resources of the advertising company, which will have their own interests. So for instance, if there is a company that is selling cow milk, obviously a vegan article won't be published in the newspaper, which is being financed by this kind of company and this kind of things. Noam Chomsky was always against the war in Vietnam and has always been an activist. Even since he was a very young age, he wrote when he was 9 years old an article about the Spanish coup d'etat and the fascist regime that was being implemented during and after the Spanish Civil War in 1939. So I don't think Chomsky had ever kind of sympathy for the American way of life. Also, he was brought in a kind of Jewish ghetto, and he witnessed the kind of fascist insults that he and his family and the other friends were receiving at that time, and the US did not do nothing in order to stop those kind of fascists to speak freely about their ideas against different cultures and so on. But in that sense, the Vietnam War is true that it changed something in the society. At least it helped to group different demands, like the civil rights movements against racism, the feminist movement, LGBTQ+, the pacifist movement. All those merged together. And Tariq Ali, for instance, has mentioned that the student revolts had a lot of energy through this kind of Vietnam War. The student revolt that happened in Berkeley after 1964, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, 1968, and so on. So the thing is like this idea of losing one's identity, it changed forever the US society. It is an interesting way to see that, and I think the 60s obviously changed not just the American society but the worldwide perception about the different kind of struggles that had to be joined together. But I'm not sure if the intellectuals like Chomsky or Lippmann, that Lippmann obviously died much before than the Vietnam War, but they always saw kind of skepticism about if the United States idea was the most appropriate to carry on kind of widening the rights for the different kind of population. And I will finish the episode here. I think it's a kind of stimulating lecture. Richard Rorty uses a lot of irony in his essay. He has written widely about this kind of ideas in our society, how the use of our language will shape the way that we experience the different things, how we communicate is important, the influence that other people and us have in each other, and how even though it is not possible to reach to a kind of common goal to achieve the absolute truth, nevertheless, it is fundamental that we keep engaging with different people to propose new measures and create this society that will be better for all the human beings.